there will be a green button at the bottom of your screen. The third button, share screen.
Yeah, I got that. Are my slides visible?
Yes, visible.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Sushant, and thank you to Dr. Akash for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'll just be discussing a few common eye disorders of neonates that we see in our routine practice. Now, vision is the most complex and important of basic senses because 90% of information about a person's surroundings reaches the brain through the eye. And that's why it's very important that we diagnose any vision threatening problems that can occur in a neonate, because that's going to seriously impact the quality of life of the baby in future. Now, when a child comes to us for a newborn eye examination, what are the things that we look for? The first test that we do is the red reflex test, following which we look at the facial features to look if there's any facial asymmetry, followed by examination of the eyelids and the adnexa, which includes the lacrimal apparatus, and then we examine the globe. So what is the red reflex test? So basically the red reflex test is, this is a direct ophthalmoscope that we use. Now with the baby sitting in the mother's lap, a light is shined into the baby's eye at an arm's distance, and we see a reflex that is produced from the baby's eye. So the basic idea is that from the ophthalmoscope, the light that's shown into the baby's eye, it passes through the cornea, the lens, and it falls on the retina, and the light that is reflected back from the retina, it is reflected through an aperture in the ophthalmoscope, and that is what the ophthalmologist is going to look at. So this is how a normal red reflex we would see. Now all these three pictures that you see are photos of kids who have a normal red reflex. So the first thing that we look for in a red reflex is to see the color of the reflex. Normally we would expect it to be a red reflex in both eyes. That's why it's called the red reflex test. The second thing we look for is to see for the symmetry of the reflex in the both eyes, whether it's symmetrical or you have one eye which is having a brighter reflex or one eye which is having an absent reflex. That's what we look for. And then we also look to see if there are any opacities within the red. Within this, any opacities is what we're looking for. So now I'm going to give you some examples of an abnormal red reflex that you would see. Now, if you look at this picture, you would see that the right eye has a normal red reflex in the pupil, whereas in the left eye, you are not seeing any reflex at all in this pupil. So this is an absent red reflex, and the commonest condition that would be associated with an absent red reflex is if the baby has a cataract in that eye. Now, if you look at this picture, you would see that you can also use the red reflex test to also look at the color of the iris. Now, if you see here, you can see that the iris in the left eye is darker in comparison to the right eye. And this difference in iris color is actually pathognomic of certain intraocular tumors. Even a retinoblastoma can present this way. So this would help you pick up an intraocular tumor. Now, if you look at this side, you can see that the right eye has a normal red reflex, whereas in comparison, the left eye has a slightly duller red reflex. And also, if you look at the alignment of the eyes, you can see that the left eye is deviated slightly inwards. So a red reflex will also help you to pick up if the baby has a strabismus, especially in a small baby who's not going to be cooperating very well for you to evaluate for the presence of a squint. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that there is a bright red reflex in both eyes. However, you can see that there is some asymmetry, like the reflex in the left eye is showing you a crescentic reflex. You would see such a reflex typically in a child who has a refractive error which is different in both eyes, that would present in such a way. So the red reflex will help you to pick up refractive errors as well. And then the last thing is the most dreaded of all the abnormal red reflexes you would see. Like if you see here, you're getting a white reflex in the baby's pupil. This is called leukoporia, the cat's eye reflex. And the dreaded condition associated with this would be an intraocular retinoblastoma. And you can also have a white reflex, that is a leukoporia, which presents in this form also. But if you look at the pupil of this child, you would see that it's like a teardrop shape. It is not exactly round as you would expect the pupil. This is because the child has a coloboma of the iris, and such kids would also have a retinochoroidal coloboma at the back of the eye, and that is what is causing the kid to have a white reflex. So leukoporia, typically some important conditions which you need to rule out when you see a white reflexes. If you see something like this, see, a cataract can present in two ways. If it's a mature cataract, you would see a white reflex happening. Whereas if it's an early cataract, the baby would just have an absent red reflex in that eye. The second condition, now if you see in this, if you compare the size of the cornea and the two eyes, you would see that the right eye cornea is smaller than the left eye. So that's called a microcornea as well. And you can see a white reflex because of a cataract. So if you see a microcornea with a white reflex because of a cataract, that's commonly seen in a condition called persistent hyperplastic primary vitreous. And this I've already told you, a coloboma of the iris. And the fourth condition, which is retinoblastoma. These are the common four conditions and important conditions which we should keep in mind. Now, retinoblastoma is actually the most common intraocular malignancy that you would see in kids. It occurs because of a mutation in the retinoblastoma 1 gene on chromosome 13. Now, it could be either hereditary or sporadic. Normally, if you have a child with a unilateral retinoblastoma, it's a sporadic occurrence with no family history, but hereditary retinoblastomas would typically be bilateral. And if you have a baby with a bilateral retinoblastoma, they have a higher chance of developing extraocular malignancies. They can have like a pinealoblastoma in these kids. So how would a retinoblastoma present to you? It could present either with a white reflex as mentioned, or if you look at this eye, you can see that apart from seeing a white reflex in the pupil, you also see a slight inward deviation of the left eye. So sometimes the only presentation of a retinoblastoma could be a child presenting with a squint. And this is how, when you dilate, you see this cheesy white mass that is seen. That's how an intraocular retinoblastoma typically looks. I'm not going into the details of the treatment because that's out of scope for this talk. But just to tell you that if a retinoblastoma is diagnosed in time, it is one of the better cancers to have in terms of life survival, with almost 90% of people surviving to adulthood if it's treated at the right time. Now, going into the second thing, what we're looking for after we are done with the red reflex is to see if there are any congenital abnormalities of the eye. The development of the eye, it typically takes place between week 3 and week 10 of gestation. So how does the eye develop? It's typically from the forebrain, that is the diencephalon. You have a small outpouching that develops on either side, which is called the optic vesicle. And the optic vesicle will be connected to the brain by a stalk, which is called the optic stalk. So the optic stalk is what forms the optic nerve of the child, and the optic vesicle is what's going to form the remaining structures of the eyeball. So now coming to some abnormalities that you would see. Now what happens if the optic vesicle doesn't develop at all? So that condition is known as congenital enophthalmos, where you don't have the eyeball developing at all. Whereas if you have an optic vesicle developing, but it's a rudimentary optic vesicle, you develop a condition that's called microphthalmos. So just to show you pictures, this is a child. You can see there's a totally empty socket here. He doesn't have an eyeball. This is complete enophthalmos. Sometimes enophthalmos can present like this, where you have a baby without an eyeball, but they have a rudimentary cyst in place of the eyeball developing. Or you can have microphthalmos, which is seen here. Like you do see a little bit of a residual cornea here, but basically even such an eye is not going to have any functional vision. So what happens in enophthalmos and microphthalmos is prognosis for vision is almost nil. But if you just leave the kid like this, what happens is they need the globe actually for growth of the orbital bones, the maxilla, to develop. So if you don't have an eye, normally you will develop mid-facial hypoplasia, which also involves the maxilla, the maxillary sinus. So in order to avoid that and stimulate growth of the orbital bones, we treat it by using conformers. So these conformers are placed in the empty socket, and what they do is they act as a stimulus for the development of the bones all around. And as the baby grows in age, and these conformers, you can put it right from the age of 6 to 8 weeks is when we start putting conformers for these babies. And as they grow big, you increase the size of the conformers. And once when the child is a little grown up, you can give them a prosthetic eye, and you can see it gives very good cosmetic outcome to the baby. Now, just before I talk about some abnormalities which affect the eyelids, just a brief description of how eyelids develop. They develop basically from the ectodermal and mesodermal folds. So typically, the ectodermal and mesodermal folds, they come together and they have to fuse. So these eyelids normally in a baby, in a fetus, they fuse around 8th week of gestation, and around 27th week of gestation is when the eyelids separate again. So in eyelid development, you can have two abnormalities developing. One is that the mesodermal folds don't fuse together. So that can lead to some problems. And also if the fused eyelids don't separate, they can lead to some problems. So what is cryptophthalmos? So cryptophthalmos mainly means it's a hidden eye. So this occurs when you don't have the folds of the eyelids don't separate at the 28th week of gestation. So it could be complete, like you see in this baby, you have like a continuous fold of skin from the forehead to the cheek. So there's no separation of the eyelids happening here. It could be either unilateral or it could be bilateral. And normally when you see a kid like this with complete cryptophthalmos, you're thinking of Fraser syndrome, and you need to investigate these patients because they can have other genital abnormalities, urinary tract abnormalities in these kids. It could be incomplete, like is seen in this child, where like the medial part of the eyelid is fused completely, but on the lateral aspect, it's a little open. Now, normally kids like this who have an incomplete cryptophthalmos have a better prognosis for vision. Because if you have a complete cryptophthalmos like this, normally the underlying cornea and the rest of the eye is also severely malformed. So prognosis for vision is very poor. Or you can have an abortive type of cryptophthalmos where you just have a small fold of skin that's attaching the lids to the cornea. Actually, this has the best prognosis in terms of visual outcome. Now, like I told you, if the eyelids need to fuse at the 7th to 8th week of gestation, so if fusion of the mesodermal folds do not happen, you develop something that's called an eyelid coloboma. So coloboma is basically any part of the body where you have a deficit of tissue that is called a coloboma. So this is how an eyelid coloboma would look. So you can either have it in the upper lid or the lower lids. Now, typically, like you see in this child, if you have a bilateral lower lid colobomas with like an anti-mongoloid slant, where the eyes are slanting downwards on the lateral aspect, this is typically seen in Treacher-Collins syndrome. Some other syndromes like Goldenhar and Chart syndrome can also be associated with lid colobomas. Now, the problem with the lid coloboma is because you don't have any tissue that's giving a protection to the underlying cornea, the cornea can get exposed and it becomes really dry and it can get opacified in future, causing problems. Also, you can develop corneal ulceration because of exposure. So babies who have eyelid colobomas, as early as 6 weeks of life, you need to start doing some eyelid grafting for them. So in order to protect their corneas and preserve vision for these kids. Now, sclerocornea is another condition where normally the cornea blends with the sclera. So normally there is no clear demarcation line between the sclera and the cornea. So it can be partial, like in this photo where only the periphery is affected, but the central part of the cornea, especially in the region of the pupil, is clear. So these kids normally have good vision. The only thing you need to rule out is refractive errors in these babies. So right from the age of 3 months, you would need to do refraction to make sure the baby doesn't require glasses. Whereas if you have a total sclerocornea that's seen in this case, prognosis for vision is very poor, whatever you do for this baby. Now, on the under surface of the optic vesicle that you have a small groove that's called the choroidal fissure. Now, what this choroidal fissure does is, it typically allows the hyaloid vessels, that's the hyaloid artery and the vein, to pass. And what these vessels do is, it typically give nourishment to the developing lens in the fetus. And normally these hyaloid vessels, they tend to regress over time. So if, and this fissure, it normally has to close at the 7th week of gestation. But what happens if the choroidal fissure doesn't fuse is, it results in something that's called a coloboma. So like you can see here, a coloboma here involving the uveal tract, that is the iris. You can see in this baby, it typically has a teardrop of keyhole shaped iris is what you would see. And these kids typically have underlying choroidal colobomas as well. This is how a choroidal coloboma would look. Now, in this case, if you see, what you see here is the coloboma. Above it, what you see is the optic disc and the macula of the fundus. So, because this coloboma is separate from the optic disc and the macula, you would expect this child to have reasonably good vision. But however, if you have a coloboma like this, which is so huge, and you can see that the inferior part of the optic disc is affected with the coloboma, such kids are going to have profound loss of vision. Now, the next other congenital abnormality that you can have is persistent hypoplastic primary vitreous. So like I told you, these hyaloid vessels which supply nourishment, this is the lens, and this is the hyaloid vessels that are supplying nourishment to the lens. Now, normally, the distal end of the hyaloid vessels are supposed to regress with age, whereas the proximal end is what forms the central retinal artery, which supplies blood vessels to the retina. So what happens when this doesn't regress is that you can get cataract occurring in these kids. Like you can see here, and typically kids' eyes which have persistent fetal vasculature, cataract, you can see persistent fetal vasculature. This is the optic nerve head, and this is a picture that stays after tissue from the lens with optic disc, and this can even correct the retina detach because of contact. Now, typically, when you have pretty much on the nasal side, inferiorly and superiorly, there's not much of iris tissue. Now, problems in a baby having aniridia would be that, they can have cataract, they can have problem with aqueous humor drainage, and that can cause congenital glaucoma. They can also have stem cell deficiency around the limbus, and that can lead to corneal opacification as the baby grows older. So, and also this is how a normal fundus would look. This is your optic nerve, and this is your macula. Whereas babies with aniridia will have macular hypoplasia. That is the macula, which is the part of the retina that's most important for vision, does not develop in these kids. And that's one of the reasons why babies with aniridia would have profound loss of vision. So just one important thing about aniridia that you should know is when you have a sporadic form of aniridia, which doesn't have any autosomal dominant pattern, those kids can sometimes have Wilms tumor associated with it. So then you have those babies and screen them for Wilms tumor. And then next, coming to the development of the lens. So how does the lens develop? Is typically when the optic vesicle comes in contact with the surface ectoderm, it causes the surface ectoderm, it thickens to form something that's called the lens placode. And the lens placode gradually invaginates and it detaches from the surface ectoderm and forms the lens of the child. So you can have a condition called congenital aphakia, where actually this lens placode doesn't develop at all. So it could be either primary or secondary. Primary is generally it's autosomal recessive because of certain mutations that happen in a baby's eye. And secondary is you do have the lens placode developing, but then because of certain intrauterine infections, especially the commonest being rubella, you can have sometimes absorption of the already formed lens. So in that case, it's called secondary aphakia. So those are some of the congenital malformations which we commonly see in practice. And now going on to some other congenital or acquired ophthalmic disorders in neonates. So I think the most important, if like this one thing that you could take home from this talk, I think it's about this condition, that's retinopathy of prematurity. And why there is so much importance on screening for retinopathy of prematurity is because it's a blinding disease of the eye, and it's typically a reversible disease. If it is screened, diagnosed, and treated in time, you're saving the kid from going blind for the rest of their life. And it's a dynamic time-bound disease. So if you do not treat it at the right time, there's no good. If you're going to diagnose it later in the stage of the disease, that also doesn't help the baby in any way. So it's very important you screen at the right time. And as you know, it typically affects premature babies and also babies who are born full term but have a stormy perinatal period. So what exactly is retinopathy of prematurity? So typically, this is the optic nerve and you have hyaloid vessels. They start growing from the optic disc and migrate outside to supply blood vessels to the growing retina. So at 32 weeks of 32 to 36 weeks of gestation is when on the nasal side the blood vessels reach the periphery. But however, on the temporal side, the blood vessels reach only at term. So if you have a baby who's born premature, you would have a part of the retina which is not supplied by blood vessels and is avascular. So what happens to an avascular retina? So before that, let's just look at what are some of the risk factors for ROP. I think prematurity and low birth weight and oxygen requirement is something that we all know. But apart from this, any child who was born even full term, if they had respiratory distress syndrome, needed to be put on cardiorespiratory support, had an intraventricular hemorrhage at birth, apnea of prematurity, neonatal sepsis, or anemia of prematurity. All these are important risk factors for ROP, and kids with any of these problems need to be screened for it. And also multiple gestations, the reason why you would need to screen is because a lot of multiple gestations have premature births, and that itself is a risk factor for ROP. So important ROP screening guidelines are you need to know whom do you screen for ROP and when do you screen. So these are the current Indian guidelines that any child who's born less than 35 weeks gestational age with a birth weight less than 2000 grams, it's mandatory that they are screened for ROP. In addition to that, like I had told you, even a full-term baby with any of the risk factors in the previous slide, they need to be screened for ROP. And when do you screen them? Typically at 3 weeks after birth. Because if you're going to screen for ROP at birth, you're not going to pick up any signs of ROP except for seeing an avascular retina. So it's important that you screen at 3 weeks because that's when the stages of ROP, if at all it's developing, would start. And if for some reason you can't do it at 3 weeks of birth, it's mandatory that you do it before the first 1 month of life in a premature baby. So this is how a normal developed retina in a full-term baby is going to look. In contrast, if you look at the premature retina, you can see a lot of it is avascular, where you see the yellow arrow marks. That is where that's the part of the retina that is not being supplied by blood vessels. So let's say you see a premature baby at this stage. There is nothing that we need to do except counsel the parents and tell them that they need to bring back the baby for a next evaluation after 3 weeks. ROP typically goes through 5 stages, and once it crosses stage 3, the child's in grave danger of losing vision. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of how ROP looks like. Now, this is a stage 1. If you look here, you can see there is a faint line here that's demarcating. This is the part of the retina that's supplied by blood vessels, and this is avascular here. So this is a stage 1 where there's just a faint demarcation line between the two zones. At this stage, no treatment is needed. Just tell the parents that it's mandatory. They come back after 2 weeks for a next screening. This is a stage 2. Like this faint demarcation line has become more prominent. And when we actually see, examine the baby's eye, we would see this as a ridge that is slightly elevated from the retina. Stage 2 also doesn't require any treatment. We just call them back for review in a couple of weeks. Look at this. This is stage 3. You can see that at the margin of the disc, can you see these blood vessels? They look angry. Here you have like angry blood vessels. To do is they're going to grow into the vitreous. So this is the stage, because this stage goes undiagnosed and miss it, it's going to reach a stage like this where retina is going to get detached and the child. There is another kind of ROP which is called APROP, that is aggressive posterior retinopathy of prematurity. It was also known as threshold disease and plus disease. If like people have heard of that, the new terminology for that is aggressive posterior ROP. Now, this ROP, if you have APROP, it normally doesn't progress to the stages like I showed you, stage 1 to stage 5. It is really aggressive, so it can pass from stage 1 to stage 5 like in a matter of just 1 to 2 days. So that's the reason why if you see a baby with APROP, you're going to treat it then and there. You cannot tell the parents that we will review again in a couple of weeks or so. So some clues when you examine the baby which will tell you that this baby probably has APROP is like, look at this. When you see the pupil is not dilating very well. Even after half an hour of waiting, you can see that this pupil is small. So that will give you that's one clue that this child could have APROP. And look at this photo. When you see it, look at the blood vessels. They look so tortuous compared to like if you look at the previous tortuous. This is a regular routine stage 2 ROP. But look at this picture. The blood vessels are so tortuous and they are dilated blood vessels with an undilating, with a poorly dilating pupil. And you can look at this, you can see some sort of a haze here. That is because the vitreous cavity is not very clear. So when you see a stage like this is called APROP and the baby needs to be treated then and there. So what are the treatment options available? One is you can either give laser photocoagulation to the avascular retina and that causes the blood vessels to grow. Or the second option is you give anti-VEGF intravitreal VEGF. VEGF is actually vasoendothelial growth factor. So if you give anti-VEGFs, it typically inhibits the proliferation of these blood vessels and that will cause the ROP stage to regress. So once you treat a patient for ROP, they are still not out of the woods. The reason being that ROP can have a lot of sequelae, commonest being strabismus, that is the baby has a high chance of getting a squint. They can have very high refractive errors, especially myopia in these kids. They can develop glaucoma and retinal detachment in the future. So once you have screened the neonate for ROP and you've said that, okay, everything is fine, your retina is stable, they need to mandatorily come back to a pediatric ophthalmologist when the baby is 3 months of age, because from 3 months of age, we need to screen for these sequelae that can happen with ROP. The next condition is a congenital cataract. Now, congenital cataract, typically 1/3 of them would be inherited, 1/3 idiopathic, and 1/3 would be syndromic. So inherited is because there's an equal distribution of all the three etiologies. So when you see a baby with a congenital cataract, the first thing that we do is we commonly examine the parents as well, because in 1/3 of kids, you would see that the parents also have some kind of congenital cataract. They either undergone surgery when they were kids, or it was just a small early cataract which didn't affect vision. So that would give you a clue, and the importance of checking parents in this case is because you're not subjecting the baby to an extensive battery of investigations trying to rule out other conditions. Then it could be syndromic, like you see in this baby with a cataract, and the fundus shows typical pigmentary features. So this is called the salt and pepper retinopathy, which you would see in congenital rubella. And in 1/3 of cases, it's just radiopathy. So it could be unilateral or bilateral. And for congenital cataracts, the routine test that we do we test for galactosemia, because if the baby has galactosemia, just a small change in the diet would actually cause the cataract to regress. Then we're ruling out intrauterine infections. Then we get a serum calcium, phosphorus, and blood sugar. These are the basic tests that we normally get done for a congenital cataract. And the treatment of congenital cataract is typically surgery. So when do you want to do the surgery? If it is unilateral, because there is a great risk that the child can develop amblyopia, that is called lazy eyes, because one eye is seeing well and it's only one eye with cataract. Early operation is advised within the first 4 weeks of birth. Whereas if it's bilateral, you have a grace period of 2 more weeks where you can do surgery. And just doing surgery for such a small baby is not going to be enough, because at 4 to 6 weeks of birth, it's not like an adult cataract where we are going to put an intraocular lens after cataract surgery. So because the child is going to be left aphakic, Visual rehabilitation is very important. So these are aphakic glasses, which you can see. These are high plus bar glasses. That is what is giving the image that the kid has very big corneas. Actually, the kid doesn't have big corneas. It's the aphakic glasses giving that appearance. And some kids would require you to do patching treatment. That is, patching is where, let's say if it's a unilateral cataract, then you're patching the good eye and allowing the baby to see only from the eye that was operated, so that there is vision, you're negating amblyopia in that baby. And you also have to introduce visual stimulation cards for these kids after doing cataract surgery. Now, congenital glaucoma is a condition wherein typically, like, the drainage of aqueous humor, which is a fluid that's present in the eye, it doesn't drain out of the eye properly because of some maldevelopment of the drainage pathway. So what happens is when aqueous humor cannot go out of the eye because you have retaining of fluid within the eye, it increases the pressure, and then the intraocular pressure is elevated, and that causes optic nerve damage. So that would be primary, that is where you only have an isolated abnormality of the drainage pathway, or it could be secondary with other conditions, like I had mentioned in aniridia that they can have glaucoma. You can also have some other conditions, like this is called the Axenfeld-Rieger's anomaly, that the baby would also have other systemic issues. They can have umbilical hernias, they have problem with their dentition. Or this is like Peters anomaly, which is another condition commonly associated with congenital glaucoma. So if you have a primary congenital glaucoma, typical features, normally primary congenital glaucoma can present at birth or within the first 3 months of life. So how would a patient present you? The commonest thing would be epiphora. Now, if you look at this baby, you can see that there is tearing of eyes. And if you compare the size of the corneas, you would see that the left eye, the cornea looks bigger than the right. That is one of the features of congenital glaucoma. Or they can have photophobia. Look at the same baby, when a light is shown into the eye, see the way he's squeezing his eyes because he's not able to tolerate the light. Or the child could have blepharospasm, where they come into your OP and the baby is like refusing to open the eyes because it's in a light atmosphere. So for congenital glaucoma, the only option available is to treat it surgically, because you can use medical management only if you want to, like, it's like a stopgap method, like if you're taking like a couple weeks or so to make sure that the kid is stable for anesthesia or anything like that. But otherwise, medical management has no role. It's purely surgical that you do. And you want to treat it at a stage like this because you don't want to leave the kid where, like, look at this. You can see that the kid has grossly enlarged corneas and you can see they're totally opaque. This is a condition that is called buphtalmus, which is like, it's projecting out. It's like buphtalmus typically means bullseye, and you don't want the kid to reach this stage. And after you treat a patient for congenital glaucoma, you can have a lot of other features. The kids can have refractive errors. So you need to periodically follow up these kids and prescribe glasses if needed. Then the next condition is congenital ptosis. That is, congenital ptosis is drooping of the upper eyelids that you can have. It's mainly because you have the levator palpebrae muscle, which elevates the lid. Maldevelopment of that is what results in congenital ptosis. So why is it important that you treat it? Now, it could be either mild, like you see in this case, or it could be moderate, or it could be severe. Now, the reason why a baby with congenital ptosis is important, why do you want to treat it, is because it can affect vision development. Now, if you have a child with mild ptosis like this, just the drooping of the eyelid, it can cause pressure on the cornea, and then the cornea can change its shape, resulting in a refractive error, which is called astigmatism. So if you have a baby like this, you're going to check and rule out astigmatism. If there is astigmatism, then such a baby would only require glasses to be prescribed because the ptosis is not much. But look here in these two pictures, the pupil is completely occluded and this is complete ptosis. So you cannot leave a baby with such kind of ptosis, because what's going to happen is that they're not going to be seen from that eye. So they're going to have stimulus deprivation, which means the kid's going to have amblyopia in that eye. A kid at this stage, either with moderate or severe ptosis, will need to be operated with surgery. And the next condition is the congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction, which is typically because you have a membranous obstruction at the lower end of the nasolacrimal duct. So after 1 year of age, we treat it with lacrimal massage, and it's important that the right way of massage is shown to the parents. This is how you have to do a lacrimal massage. Whereas if it's beyond the age of 1 year, massage is not going to help. You would have to do a lacrimal probing and syringing for this baby. Have a congenital dactyocystocele is a variant of congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction. So what happens is, now at the distal end, you have something called the valve of Hasner, where the nasolacrimal duct opens into the nose, and the proximal end in the region of the lacrimal sac, you have a valve that's called the valve of Rosenmuller. So in a dactyocystocele, what happens is both the valve of Rosenmuller and Hasner's valve both are closed. So because the fluid that is in the lacrimal sac has no place to drain, it swells up and it causes this kind of a bluish cystic swelling will be seen. A baby presenting like this. So in most cases, this can be managed conservatively just by using topical antibiotics, and massaging would take care of this problem. But what happens in some cases is they can also have an intranasal cyst forms in some babies with a congenital dactyocystocele. And I think like you all know, babies are essentially, they are nasal breathers. So if you have something in the nose like this, which is blocking the nose, especially at the time when the kid is feeding and sleeping, it can cause respiratory distress. So if you see something like this, a kid with dactyocystocele that's not responding to treatment, and you notice any signs of respiratory distress, it's an emergency and you will have to do a probing. Along with that, a nasal endoscopy is also done on the baby so that, you know, the cyst, marsupialization of the cyst needs to be done, and you treat the condition. Now, just a couple more conditions. Ophthalmia neonatorum, that is typically it's conjunctivitis that occurs in the first month of life. Now, the important organisms which are vision threatening would be if the baby has Neisseria gonorrhea or chlamydia, which is causing conjunctivitis. Now, typically, especially gonorrhea is very important because if it is not treated, it can cause corneal ulceration and the cornea perforates, and the child will have irreversible loss of vision. So if you have a baby like this, where you are seeing like these crusts around the eyelids with mucopurulent discharge, you should always keep Neisseria gonorrhea in mind, and then you send conjunctival swabs. And important to remember is that chlamydia presents like this with profound mucopurulent discharge and condition that you see. So both these conditions, there is no role of treating the kid with topical. So then it's no longer, it's the onus is no longer on ophthalmologist, but on the neonatologist, because they would need systemic treatment. So if it's gonorrhea, you're going to treat them with a single dose of intramuscular ceftriaxone. While if it's chlamydia, they can either you have to put the baby on erythromycin for 14 days, or now there's a shorter course where you can use azithromycin for 3 days. And then viral, the commonest would be herpes simplex. So you would see, I don't have a picture of that. You would actually see herpetic lesions around the eyelids, and then you would see hemorrhagic conjunctivitis like this. You have a lot of hemorrhages. So hemorrhages will be typically seen in viral conjunctivitis in a baby. So they have to be treated with systemic acyclovir for 14 days. Along with that, there is the role of topical antivirals as well in these babies. And then torch infections, I've already mentioned congenital rubella. Another common thing that we see is congenital toxoplasmosis, which will typically present, you have a baby presenting to you with a large angle squint, not seeing very well. And then when you dilate, this is what you see at the macula, you have a punched out scar like this, and then you know that you're dealing with congenital toxoplasmosis in this child. Then neonatal hypoxia and hypoglycemia are also two important conditions which can affect vision. Now, typically what happens is if you have hypoxia and hypoglycemia in a full-term baby, it's mainly the visual cortex in the occipital lobe that's going to get affected. Whereas if it's a premature baby, it's the white matter around the ventricles that gets affected, and they develop a condition called periventricular leukomalacia. So how does these conditions affect vision? So you will have a baby who presents to you with subnormal vision. They come at 3 to 4 months, parents saying the child's not making eye contact, not responding to any visual stimuli, or the child could have a squint. They have like tonic down gaze where both the eyeballs are just fixed in down gaze like that. And when these babies grow up, they would have functional visual abnormalities. Like, you know, they can appreciate color, but they won't be able to tell you what that colored object is. Like they would say, this is red color, but they wouldn't know that that's a red rose that they are seeing. and they're able to appreciate things which are moving. But if you give them a static stimulus, which is sedentary, they're not going to respond to that. And if the occipital cortex is involved in these babies, they can present with visual field defects once they grow big. So that's why it's important that if you have a baby with neonatal hypoxia or hypoglycemia, they are sent to a pediatric ophthalmologist for evaluation. And then infantile strabismus, just to mention to you all that if you have an intermittent squint in a baby less than 6 months of age, it is normal. But if you have a squint beyond the age of 6 months, even if it is intermittent, it is no longer normal, and it's mandatory that they're evaluated by a pediatric ophthalmologist. While if you have a constant squint at any age, it is abnormal. So you can even have a 1-month baby, but if you see that the squint is all the time present, it is abnormal and they need to be evaluated. So you can have an infantile, it could be either an esotropia, where the eye deviates inwards, or an exo, like in this condition where it deviates outwards. Now, just to differentiate, like if you have an infantile esotropia, in most of these babies, the neurological exam will be normal and the ophthalmic examination is normal. So it's not a worrisome problem, except for the fact that yes, these children are going to need surgery to correct the squint. But if you have an infantile exotropia, if there is no family history of either of the parents having a squint, a lot of these kids would have ocular abnormalities. So you're looking at things like either an intraocular tumor like retinoblastoma, or a cataract which is causing the child to have an infantile exotropia. Or if when you examine the eyes, nothing is found, then a lot of these kids have neurological abnormalities, and that's why it's mandatory that if you see a kid with an infantile exotropia with no family history and eye examination being normal, we advise parents to get neuroimaging done for these babies. And why do you want to treat infantile strabismus? Why is it so important you treat it at a young age? Because if you leave it untreated, the child is going to lose stereopsis when he grows big. Because stereopsis, that is our ability to perceive depth, it develops only in the first 2 years of life. So if you don't treat infantile strabismus before that age, then the child has lost all their hope of ever seeing things in a 3-dimensional view. And they can also develop amblyopia, that is lazy eyes, where vision is going to be subnormal in the eye with the squint. So just to conclude, a thorough eye evaluation in neonates would help pick up many vision threatening and sometimes even life threatening disorders, which can be averted with timely intervention. So when you see any neonate with risk factors like prematurity, low birth weight, hypoxia, hypoglycemia, sepsis, and a stormy perinatal period, it's very important that you remember that all these conditions can affect vision, not just in like causing ROP, but also they can have cortical visual impairment when they grow big. So it's mandatory that they are sent to pediatric ophthalmologists by the time they are 3 months of age. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rachna. Thank you for this elaborative talk. It is like covering every aspect and entire syllabus in short span of time. Now,
I'm not able to hear you very well.
Now, am I audible?
But your voice is not very loud. I'm not able to hear you that well.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you again for the such an elaborate talk, covering every aspect in such a small span of time. Now we'll take some question and answers posted by the participants. First, let me cover. There is one Dr. Narasimha wants to know that as per his experience during a leisure for ROP, he has encountered cardiorespiratory arrest either during procedure or post procedure. So he wants to know if there is any specific precautions or remedies for this.
Actually, I don't treat ROP myself. I only diagnose it. The laser is given by a retina specialist in our hospital. So I'm not the right person to answer this, but yes, we always do it in the neonatal ICU if it's needed. But
Okay.
I'm not sure about this, whether they can develop an ocular cardiac reflex. I'm not really sure about this. I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Okay. But as a neurologist, we always arrange the arrangement like putting the baby in a strict cardiorespiratory monitor and give adequate pain relief. So, what pain relief do you suggest during such examination itself? So, what sort of pain relief is the best pain relief for the babies?
See, we don't give any pain relief. The only thing that we do is we tell the mother that the baby should be fasting before we do the procedure.
Okay.
And then, like, while the procedure is being done, actually we give them a cotton ball that is soaked in 5% dextrose solution, and we
Okay.
put that in the baby's mouth so that they are more comfortable while the procedure is being done. But we
Okay.
don't give any real
Pain.
medicine like pain management.
Some the guidelines suggest 20 availability. If there is availability of 24% sucrose solution, then that will be best. If not, any form of sweetener like pure breast milk also acts as a best pain relief during ROP screening. So some patients with ePROP have difficult eye dilatation. So what sort of eye dilator do you recommend for this section of baby?
I'm not able to hear you.
Sorry, I was asking that some babies with the ePROP, their pupils are very resistant to dilatation. So as such, and for these babies also, what sort of dilators do you recommend?
Dilating drops, huh?
Yeah.
We use the routine dilating drops that we get. Actually, we use it in like the lower dilution for all premature babies. Like normally we dilute the strength of the tropicamide drops by 50% when we use it. But the thing with APROP is it's generally posterior. So it's like in the central part of the fundus is what is affected. So even though the pupil is not well dilated, we are still able to visualize the part which needs treatment because it's very posterior. It doesn't go to the periphery. So it's easier to treat in that case.
Okay. Dr. Anuja wants to know the correct method of lateral massage.
See, the correct method is that, you know, you have to give, I had shown a picture. So typically it has to be done just below the medial canthus. You can
Okay.
use either the index finger or the little finger has to be used. So you just apply pressure inwards. It should be here, just
Okay.
below the medial canthus. You press inwards and then release it. And then you can press inwards and release it. Normally, we ask you to do at least 40 to 50 times in a day. So you divide it 4 times, and to be done when the child is drinking milk, because that's when the kid is most comfortable. So then each time you're doing like 10 to 15 strokes that you give there.
Okay. Okay. Until how many months does it require?
Till 1 year of age, we can do massaging and see.
Okay.
If it
Okay.
doesn't resolve by 1 year of age, then the obstruction starts getting hard. So then we have to do a probing has to be done for it.
Okay. 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 So, Dr. Samarth wants to know what the scope of stem cell therapy in treatment of eye disease like corneal injury. Do you have any patients like
The stem cell therapy is
therapy?
good. Like we normally use like amniotic membrane grafts. Those things can be used for like corneal, especially for chemical injuries. If you have it, we do use stem cells, and that gives very good results actually.
Okay.
For especially for chemical injuries like chemical burns, like alkali injuries. That
Okay. And Dr. Namrata wants to know what to be done in infants with the unilateral and bilateral esotropia.
Unilateral esotropia, that means it's not alternating. The baby is always squinting only in one eye. Then we first have to rule out and see if there is any problem. Like I told you, sometimes a retinoblastoma can also present with an esotropia. So you need to rule out that there's no abnormality like that. Then the second thing that we have to do is check and see if the child has a glasses power, like a refractive error. Like a high plus power can also cause the child to have unilateral squint. So then you're going to prescribe glasses, and then you have to do patching treatment. Patching treatment means the eye that is a good eye, the eye which is not squinting, you apply a patch for that eye and you force the baby to see from the squinting eye at least 50% of the waking hours in order so that the child doesn't lose vision in that eye. And that needs to be done at least for 6 months till the squint starts alternating. If it's a alternating, like if it's a bilateral, that is, it's either the right or the left, the same protocol is followed. Without the patching is not necessary. And if there is no refractive error, then you need to operate on those kids to correct the squint. And it has to be done before the age of 2 years.
Okay.
Dr.
Dr. Shashi is there. He wants to ask Dr. Shashi, please.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Rachana. Firstly, your talk was so lucid. It was a grand talk. I really appreciate. And I just wanted to clarify my basic things which you have conveyed, but I wanted to reconfirm. The first thing, small thing I want to know, routine neonatal eye care at birth in a mother who is unbooked, you do not know whether she has got infection, gonorrhea, yes or no. So earlier, we used to give silver nitrate. Some people later erythromycin. Then now we are giving that saline soaked, simple cleaning. What is the right advice?
I think the right advice would be just to clean with saline, because would be if you're going to use silver nitrate, that itself can cause chemical contamination.
Chemical. Okay. Second small question related to ROP. In general, we are very concerned when baby is less than 32 weeks or less than 1500 gram, of course, with STOMI course. 34 weeks and 1800 grams, more than that, they are going to postnatal ward with mother, KMC and other things. And facilities on the ground for indirect ophthalmoscopy, ROP detection is not, very easy. So what do you have to say? Are they at risk and we should religiously, because you told us less than 35 weeks, less than 2 kgs. So, practically on the ground, I'm finding it, I don't know how much we'll be able to perform. So incidence wise, because in one of the studies in ROP I was involved, that was in AIMS with Dr. Paul, Dr. Hirsch used to be there, Dr. Ujjwala. Our protocol was less than 32 weeks and less than 1500 grams. I think around 97 cases, I had my own record as a resident at that time, in which I got 1 or 2 positive cases which needed treatment. Otherwise, temporarily, there used to be a stage 1, stage 2, then involution used to take place when we followed up to 36 weeks. So for more than 34 weeks and more than 1800 grams, what will be the right advice? Taking into consideration the practical things.
Fellowship, actually, we did a study to see what is the incidence of ROP in heavy babies, that is kids who are born between 1500 to 2 kgs weight. And we found that there were almost 5% of those babies also presented with ROP. Not necessary that it needed treatment. It could have either been a stage 1 or 2, but we had 5% of babies who did present with ROP in that stage as well. So now the guidelines say that yes, you need to screen up to 2 kgs weight, because you're going to miss out on that 5%, and probably of that 5%, maybe 1% of those kids would require treatment, and then you're losing out on that if you don't screen them.
Okay, I would love to know if those articles comes, if you can send it to me.
So the main thing is that it is the RBSK guidelines and the Indian government guidelines. If we do not follow the guidelines, then the doctor, the concerned person, can be sued. And in fact, there were cases in recent, including the AIMS, where the doctor had to pay in crores just because he had not prescribed. So whatever the guidelines are there, even if the percentage is less, we have to follow it, because even if one baby's eyesight is saved, it means
Not yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarification.
Thank you, sir.
So
Dr. Chandra wanted to ask, Dr. Chandrakant.
Can unmute yourself.
You can proceed with other questions. I think he has left.
Okay. So what should be the ideal timing for the visual lever potential? So in every baby, do you recommend visual evok potential every preterm baby, or some subsections of baby those require visual evok potential?
Not as a routine. You wouldn't recommend it as a routine for every premature baby, because you're anyway going to follow them up at once you screen for ROP, then you're going to screen them again at 3 months of age. So at 3 to 4 months of age, you're anyway going to look at their response to visual stimuli, because normally in a premature baby, more than the VEP getting affected, it's you're worried about the retina having a problem. So we don't normally get a routine VEP done, but like someone was asking over here, like in a case of cerebral palsy, if the VEP is undetected, what should we do next? So I think you're getting a VEP done only if you're not going to see any response when you're examining the child. There is like absolutely no response that is being done. But if you are not getting a reading at 6 months and you see that the kid is not, the baby is not responding very well to stimuli, what we do is we start if the kid, if we get any reactive, we give the glasses and we start the kid on visual stimulation exercises, and we call them back again after 3 months, and then we repeat the VEP again after 3 months in those babies. But it's important that you stress to the parents that they do the visual stimulation exercises, and then we see how the response is. Because the thing is, like, in every child getting a VEP is difficult, because sometimes they would require to be, most cases, like at least in our hospital, we have only a flash VEP. And a flash VEP is where they're just going to give a bright stimulus and see whether there's any response from the cortex. You're not actually giving them a pattern. VEP is not done. So, and many cases they say that they can't do it for a baby. They need to, it's not possible in every place to do it. Like even in Hyderabad, which is a metro, like we have a VEP only like in 2 centers in the whole city. So we don't get it done on a routine basis unless we see that there's absolutely no response when we clinically examine the kid.
Okay. So here Dr. Boni wants to clarify which drug is best, would you recommend for anti-VEGF therapy, bevacizumab or ranibizumab?
Actually, both are used. Again, this is not a question that I can answer, because intravitreal injections are given by the retina consultant. So I'm not the right person to answer this question on which would be better.
So, like as you have mentioned, all babies with conjunctivitis need gram stain or swab culture to diagnose, or any pointers where it is becomes must?
Sorry?
All babies with conjunctivitis, do they need to undergo gram stain test or swab culture test to diagnose the type of organism?
If you're looking at a neonate with conjunctivitis, let's say they have like preauricular lymph node enlargement, or you're seeing a lot of conjunctival hemorrhages, then that's more in favor of a viral infection. So you're going to presumptively look at it at viral and treat it. So then we're not getting a gram stain done for those patients. But if there's very bad mucopurulent discharge, and there's like, a lot of chemosis of the conjunctiva, swelling of the lids, then in those babies, yes, we do get a gram stain done, because then you want to rule out gonorrhea in those states.
Okay. And here I can see a query from Dr. Rashmi. She says, could you please elaborate on
who has a squint? So what you basically do is, like, you would put an occluder in front of one eye, and let's say, like, I think if you can look at my screen, if you see that, let's say my left eye is deviating inwards, you put a cover in front of the baby's right eye and see whether the left eye is moving out to take fixation. So if it's an ESO deviation, the left eye, which is like this, now it needs to look at a target, so it's going to move outwards. Whereas if you had an eye which was squinting outwards, it's going to move in. So that's what the cover test is. You cover one eye and you look and see how the fixation of the eye that is uncovered is. And the second thing is the uncover test. So what you do in that is you cover once you've covered one eye, then you uncover to see what is the position of the eye. So let's say there is an eye where the baby's eye is squinting inwards, the left eye is inwards, and you covered the right eye, and then the left eye moves outside for the baby to take fixation and look at whatever target you're showing. And then let's say I uncover this eye. If once I uncover this eye, if the baby is able to hold fixation with the left eye, it means that vision in the left eye is good. But let's say once an eye which is like this, I have covered the good eye, the eye comes straight, and then when I uncover the eye, if immediately the eye squints again, it means that vision is low in that eye. So that would help you to differentiate whether it's an alternate squint or it's a unilateral squint. So that will help you in your management, whether you want to start patching treatment for the baby or not. So it's mainly done to evaluate squints.
Okay. Okay. So a small query. Do you use RedCam to document the ROP stage while screening? Do you use RedCam or some image storing system where you can show to parents that this is the stage of the disease or
We
the
don't
follow-up?
have a red cam here, but in Narayan Nethralaya, where I did my fellowship, we had a red cam. So actually it helps to, mainly the red cam helps, one is for documentation and to show parents, because when you just tell them that we are seeing a
Exactly.
stage 1 and we want you to come back for
Exactly.
follow-up, they won't really
Exactly.
understand. But
The
once
visual.
they see an image like that, it definitely helps. But a red cam, we don't have it where I work. So we just do screening with an indirect ophthalmoscope.
Fine, fine, fine. And two more queries left to in our chat box. What is the scope of electrophysiological assessment of optic nerve disorders? Dr. Samarth wants to know. So
We do a VP only in cases where like a baby is not responding, and when we examine the eye, we don't see any cause that could explain why that's happening, then yes, we get a VP done, because you want to see if there is something retrobulbar which is affecting the optic nerve, which is causing the child to have poor vision. But not in all optic nerve disorders. Like when you examine an optic nerve, if you're already seeing that the optic nerve is pale, then that itself tells you that the child is going to have subnormal vision. So those babies don't need to be subjected to a VP to be done for them.
okay, okay. And Dr. Kalyan wants to know: should babies with ROP who have undergone laser photocoagulation be monitored for field of vision? How to assess the field of vision or subsequently visual
This
development?
normally field of vision, if they have to perform a test, the kid needs to be at least 6 years of age before they can cooperate for a computerized vision field test analysis.
Okay.
So we have not generally seen a lot of kids having problems in field of vision. So we don't really do it. We don't document a field of vision that regularly. I don't have much experience. We've not done any study on this to see like what the field of vision would be like. But definitely, yes, when you do laser photocoagulation, like when we do it for adults with diabetic retinopathy, we do see that, yes, those patients will have loss of a peripheral field of vision. So I'm sure the same thing would apply to ROP as well. They would have peripheral constricted visual fields.
Sometimes a common parental query that what should be the age for determination of visual acuity in the baby? What
Sorry?
should be the earliest age where we can determine the visual acuity in a baby?
The earliest age at which we can determine. Okay.
Yes.
The visual acuity we can determine even in a baby who's like, let's say 2 months, 3 months of age, we can determine the visual acuity. If you want a quantitative assessment, it can be done only with a VEP actually, because
Okay.
normally the visual acuity, when documented with a VEP, it roughly for a newborn baby, like let's say in the first 1 month of life, by a VEP, it's normally supposed to be around 20 by 400 to 20 by 600. If you would convert it into Snellen's visual acuity, that's what it would be.
So, as of now, we have responded all the queries. Dr. Rashmi said, like we have taken that question like what is the indications of VEP in neonates? So we have discussed all babies do not need VP exam.
Only in kids not showing any response to not showing any visual response. And when you have a normal ocular examination, that we're not seeing anything in the fundus, the optic nerve, retina is healthy, only then we would advise you to get a VP done.
I think all questions have answered. Very
If-
exhaustive lecture indeed, covered every aspect. Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Doctor.
Archana.
Thank you, Dr. Rachana and Dr. Sushant for moderating a session. In fact, I think such sessions, in fact, encourage us to have more sessions on subspecialty, because we know after listening to Dr. Rachana's lecture, we come to know that how little we know about our subspecialties. And in fact, it was very well presented and it covered majority of our OPD patients, where we tend to refer them left and right. If somebody wants to ask any questions, kindly raise your hands. And I would like our the Vice President from LAP, Dr. Niranjan sir, to say a few words. And I would encourage, if anybody has any questions left, kindly raise your hands. We will unmute and you can ask directly.
Thank you, Dr. Akash. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Lucknow Neonatology Foundation and NARC, I would like to thank Dr. Rachana for an excellent overview on the topic. Apart from ROP, which most of the neonatal units now are sensitized to screen, you also covered other common conditions affecting the newborns. I just had wanted to know your opinion. If facilities are available, do you think that a routine eye examination of all babies by a trained pediatric ophthalmologist or an ophthalmologist is a good idea, so that we don't miss out on some not so common defects? Dr. Rachana, please.
Sir, I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear what you asked actually. Your voice is very faint.
Sir wants to know if facilities are available. Is it prudent to do eye examination of every newborn by a pediatric ophthalmologist?
Yeah, we do it like actually a lot of the hospitals in Hyderabad now, they have like a mandatory eye checkup for all newborns at 3 weeks of age. So we go to the hospitals on a scheduled day and they pull up all the babies. So we do like a routine red reflex test for all the babies who come, and just have a quick look to see, like, you know, there are any structural abnormalities, if the child has a cataract. So we just do that basic evaluation for all kids now at 3 weeks of age.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sushant, for moderating the session well. Over to you, Dr. Akash.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for your kind words. I would like to thank again our speaker today, Dr. Rachana. It was such a wonderful listening to you and learning from you. And Dr. Sushant, always nice to have with yours. So with that, we end today's session, and we'll be back next Saturday. Till then, be safe and stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you.